It seems strange to me that a man who, as a soldier, became accustomed to blind obedience for nearly 6 years should suddenly come into conflict with the state and its constitution. To explain this, I must go back to my youth, because there indeed is the seed of the conflict between me and today's constitution and governing bodies. As a young man of 16 and a half years of age, I was forced to earn my own bread. I came to Vienna when I was barely 17, and there I became thoroughly acquainted with three things. First, the social question. For the first time there, I felt the great misery and hardship of the broad masses of society firsthand. Secondly, the racial problem in the city where East and West more or less meet. In Vienna, one can study the racial problem better than anywhere in Germany, because there, according to my political conviction, the greatest enemy and adversary of all Aryan humanity emerges more strongly and sharply than in Munich or in the rest of Germany in general. Thirdly, in Austria, I became acquainted with that movement which was founded by a certain race and which exploits the great needs of the broad masses in order to build up an organization whose consequences would inevitably lead to the collapse of the entire modern state. That is the Marxist movement. I arrived in Vienna a cosmopolitan and left an out-and-out anti-Semite and a mortal enemy of the entire Marxist worldview. I then came to Munich and earned my bread here until the war came. I was convinced that the fate of Germany and that of German Austria would not be decided in the Austrian army, but in the German army. Accordingly, I enlisted for service in the latter. When it was announced on November 7th, 1918, that there was revolution had broken out in Munich, I couldn't believe it at first. But by November 9th, it became clear to me. And that night, my decision was made. The great vacillation in my life, whether I would turn to politics or whether I would remain a builder, came to an end. I decided that night that if I got my vision back, I would turn to politics. I came to Munich, and a few weeks later, I was with a reserve battalion. My further political development, relatively simple. I was active during the period of the Council Republics, and as a result of my resistance during the Council period, came to the attention of my superiors and was invited into the Intelligence Commission of Infantry Regiment. Here I came into contact with the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At that time, it was still called the German Workers' Party. The movement had 6 members. I was the 7th. The Marxist movement works with 2 powerful instruments. On the one hand, it employs an enormous propaganda apparatus with mass influence. The bourgeoisie does not understand Marxism, does not know that the little boy who is taken out of school and inducted into this doctrine is thereby ultimately alienated from the state and society, and if this is consistently continued, soon becomes ripe to enter the trade unions as an apprentice. How he then becomes further and further alienated from his people, relies exclusively on manual labor, fundamentally rejects the intellect as bourgeois, and that this doctrine will lead to a monstrous force within the state, to a confrontation of the brute fist against genius and knowledge. Through this doctrine, it becomes possible for a man of 30 to 40 years of age to become a mortal enemy of his own brother, to call the comrades of his own German blood mortal class enemies, while he regards our real enemies, the English and French, or even the Hottentots, who are completely racially foreign to him, as brothers. The second instrument of this movement is an unprecedented terror. No movement has operated with such thorough knowledge of the nature of the masses as the Marxist movement. It knows that the masses have respect for strength and determination, and it has substituted brute power and brute will for the weakness and indecisiveness of the bourgeoisie, has ruthlessly subordinated the individual and given the workers an ultimatum. Either you be my brother or I'll stove your skull in. At first I was fighting a losing battle. Nevertheless, in the course of a few years, a movement has emerged from that small group of 6 men, which today comprises millions, and which, above all, has made the broad masses national-minded again. We were clear that we could not get by with the old methods of whining and pleading. A government cannot protect an intellectual movement. Therefore, we decided on the following principle: for those who are willing to fight with intellectual weapons, we have the intellect. For the others, we have our fists. Our propaganda machine was joined by the Sturmabteil in order to prevent our movement from being terrorized and our supporters from being crushed. There were places where we could not hold a meeting for a long time. The SA had no military significance. Its sole purpose was to be an organization capable of meeting terror from the left with even greater terror from our side. Until 1923, the SA never deviated from this purpose. We had already realized in 1922 that the Ruhr would be lost. France's aim was not only to weaken Germany, but to break it up into small states in order to be able to hold the Rhine region. We knew after the repeated declarations of weakness that after the Saar region and after Upper Silesia, we would also lose our third coal basin, the Ruhr, one loss after another. Our movement was thus at loggerheads with the bourgeois world for the first time. The Folkish movement realized that the Ruhr could not be preserved by mere passive resistance, but only by reawakening the national will to resist. An active front in this sense had to be built up behind the Ruhr. This was impossible as long as the truce was maintained, which had already broken the neck of the German people in 1914. We too wanted a united front, but not between people of whom one was prepared to climb the redoubt and sacrifice his life while the other would stab him in the back. Only fervent, ruthless, brutal fanaticism could have saved the situation at that time. The Reich government would have had to let the hundreds of thousands of young men who came home from the Ruhr to the Reich under the old colors of black, white and red flow together in a powerful national wave. In countless public rallies, we advocated national revival. Instead, these young people were sent back. The government reduced the national resistance to a paid general strike. They forgot that an enemy like France cannot be prayed to death, still less lazed to death. Billions were thrown into this useless resistance. The German financial system was torn apart, and the conditions were created for the formation of those factions who, because they had forgotten how to work, because they had not been educated to be willing to make sacrifices, later attacked us as separatists. The national will, the great uprising of the nation, was allowed to wither and dry up, just as it did in 1914. At that time, I went to Otto Hermann von Lossow and explained to him that the resistance could only be led from the nationalist side. We must therefore vigorously support these elements. Our youth has only one thought, and let this be heard in Paris, that the day will come when we are free again. Lossow said at the time that there were two possibilities: either to support the resistance, that energetic form, or if the whole thing fell apart, each state would have to look after itself. That, of course, would lead to the destruction of the Reich. I was inwardly very disturbed by this at the time, For my attitude is that I would rather be hanged if Germany should turn Bolshevik than perish under the rule of French sabers. It was then that the inner conversion of our movement took place, as is also emphasized in the indictment. The development of events in the Ruhr conflict proved us right. It showed that the backstabbers were more powerful than ever. On May 1st, we tried to see to it that at least in one town, the Soviet flag could no longer be flown. The authorities opposed us for the first time. They protected the Soviet flag. After that, I did not go to the military district command anymore, since I saw that further talks were worthless. With pride, I confess that it was our people who put up the only real resistance in the Ruhr. We wanted to initiate a propaganda campaign throughout Germany in a series of 14 meetings with the slogan, "Down with the Ruhr traitors." But a ban on these meetings took us by surprise. I had met Herr von Kahr in 1920. It was also after a putsch that he ascended to his ministerial chair. Kahr had given me the impression that he was an honorable civil servant. I spoke to Kahr for the first time when it was a question of disarming the Einwohnerwehr. I implored Kahr not to disarm the Einwohnerwehr because that would mean the loss of Upper Silesia. Herr von Kahr assured me that he would never agree to the Einwohnerwehr being disarmed, that we could rest assured with him. A few days later, the Einwohnerwehr was disbanded. I spoke with Kahr briefly a second time in a private conversation, but not since. It is not enough for a statesman to have a clean record. Before the war, that was what was demanded of the lowest civil servant. Kahr did not have other qualities that one must demand of a statesman in this situation. He did not have the iron fist to impose order. If Kahr had capable people behind him, he could achieve great things. But it was Pühner standing behind him at that time. It was Pühner, not Kahr, who did the work back then. Von Kahr did not seem to me personally the man to fulfill the great expectations of the German people. He will, I said to myself, take a giant run-up only to collapse when the fight is about to begin. I went to Losser. I explained to him that I was not coming to him from political motives, because in my eyes he was politically a dead man. Lossow had indeed refused to obey the head of the Reichswehr, and it was naivety to think that there was any other remedy than overthrowing him or fighting for what was right. Ludendorff was also convinced of this, saying, what Lossow is doing is a battle from which he can only emerge victorious or fallen. I explained to Lossow at the time that I personally regarded the matter as a tremendous misfortune. The people had expected a gigantic wave. They had believed that the collapse would become the cause of a flood, which would gradually take hold of the whole German people and drive out the Marxist International. From the struggle against Marxism, from the gigantic uprising, a dictatorship was to rise. Now a man came and immediately declared himself dictator. Herr von Kahr could not fulfill the hopes placed in him. He was quite incapable of doing so. No one will dispute his outstanding human qualities. But I already said at the time that what is being demanded now is something else. The struggle against Berlin, as led by Herr von Kahr, is a crime unless one is determined to face the consequences, to incorporate the struggle into the German national uprising from the first minute on. I said that they had now turned the matter into a Bavarian rejection of Berlin's demands. The people, however, had expected something other than a beer price reduction, a milk price decree, a butter barrel confiscation, and similar impossible economic measures where one had to ask oneself which had been consulted. Every failure was bound to increase the genius anger of the masses And I pointed out that people would make fun of Carr's measures now and be outraged later. I told Lossow, if you lead the struggle to its end, then there can only be a political and military offensive. If you cross the Rubicon, you must also march on Rome. Or if you don't want the struggle, then there is only surrender. The struggle was to be directed northwards. It could not be led by a purely Bavarian organization. It only promised success if it was led by a force that could be seen as the coming German national army. Herr von Lossow recognized this as correct and asked me whom I had in mind. I explained, you and Caesar must lead the fight yourselves. But Ludendorff comes to mind as the only man for the top. I had seen Ludendorff in the field, and in 1921 I was able to speak to him personally for the first time. I realized that he was not only the most outstanding general in the field, but that he had now also relearned and recognized the reasons that had brought the German nation to its downfall. The fact that Ludendorff was being pulled down by the others was one more reason for me to join him more closely. So I proposed Ludendorff, and Lossow and Caesar had no objection. I further explained it to Lossow that nothing could be achieved now with petty economic means. The struggle is with Marxism. To solve this problem, you don't need administrators, you need firebrands who are able to inflame national enthusiasm to the utmost. Carr could not do that. The youth was not behind him. I could join, I declared, only on the condition that the political struggle be placed exclusively in my hands. But that was not impudent or immodest of me. I am rather of the opinion that when a man knows that he alone can do a thing, he must not be modest.